The oral histories collected in West Feliciana Parish speak of a specter that haunted the Honey Island swamp long after the cannons of the Civil War fell silent. For 6 full years, from 1856 until the winter of 1862, the ledger at Briarwood Plantation listed the carpenter as deceased, swallowed by the unforgiving muck of the Louisiana lowlands. Julian Vane, the master of the estate, even commissioned a limestone marker at the perimeter of his land, etched with a grim warning about the fate of those who challenged their God-given bondage. The patrols ceased, the reward of $500 was withdrawn, and the white hierarchy convinced themselves that the wild hogs or alligators had disposed of the problem. Yet, on the freezing evening of December 24, 1862, when a conflagration erased the big house and claimed 9 lives, the falsehood of that stone marker was exposed in a singular, devastating moment of truth. The fugitive had not fled to the northern states, nor had he perished in the brackish water. Instead, he had constructed a life in the shadows of the very property that sought to own him, dwelling closer to his oppressors than any rational mind could fathom. For those long years, he existed less than 100 yards from the center of power, watching the daily rhythms of torture and commerce with a predator's patience. He did not merely survive, he observed, cataloging the sins of the ruling class with the precision of a ledger keeper. His name was Elias Thorne, and his transformation from a skilled laborer into an instrument of retribution remains one of the most calculated resistance operations ever recorded in the antebellum South. He proved that the ultimate camouflage is not absence, but the profound invisibility bestowed upon the ignored. The story of the shadow of Briarwood, as it was whispered among the enslaved populations along the Mississippi River, is a narrative constructed from the fragments of a suppressed history. It is a study in the weaponization of patience and the terrifying power of a man who has already accepted his own death. While the official records of West Feliciana Parish attempt to gloss over the events of that Christmas Eve as a tragic accident caused by a knocked-over lamp, the archived testimonies of the descendants tell a different story. They speak of a man who turned the harsh landscape of the swamp into a fortress, who weaponized his invisibility, and who waited for the precise alignment of stars to bring down a dynasty built on human chattel. The temperatures that night dropped below freezing, yet the heat generated by the vengeance of Elias Thorne was enough to warm the spirits of the oppressed for generations. Letters discovered in the attics of neighboring plantations, dated to the spring of 1863, reveal a palpable terror that gripped the planter class in the weeks following the fire. The existence of Thorne challenged the fundamental premise of the slave system, that the enslaved were either content or broken. Here was proof that a man could endure solitary confinement in the open air, sustaining himself on refuse and rage, all while plotting the destruction of his captors. Historians from Louisiana State University have noted that the psychological impact of the Briarwood incident rivaled that of any armed uprising, for it introduced the concept of the ever-present unseen observer. The masters began to look over their shoulders, wondering if their own carpenters, stable hands, and cooks were similarly watching, similarly waiting, and similarly sharpening the blade of justice in the dark. The legend grew that the fire was not set by human hands, but by a conjurer, a root worker who summoned the spirits of the wronged to burn the mansion to the ground. This mythologization served a dual purpose. It preserved the safety of those who might have assisted Thorne, and it elevated a singular act of violence into a folk miracle. The spirituals sung in the quarters afterward referenced the fiery chariot that swept through on Christmas night, a coded message that bypassed the understanding of the white overseers. To the enslaved, Thorne was no longer a man. He was a force of nature, a retribution that walked on two legs. The shift from fact to folklore happened almost overnight, blurring the line between the historical Elias Thorne and the supernatural avenger the community needed him to be. Modern archaeological surveys of the Briarwood site, conducted in the late 20th century, uncovered the charred foundations of the big house, but they failed to locate the limestone warning marker mentioned in the oral histories. It is believed that Union soldiers or freedmen destroyed the stone during the occupation, erasing the master's final insult to the dead. However, the lack of physical evidence for the marker does little to discredit the narrative. Rather, it underscores the successful erasure of the master's narrative by the survivors. The absence of the stone mirrors, the absence of Elias Thorne's body, a deliberate vanishing that cemented his status as a phantom. The landscape itself seemed to conspire to keep his secrets, with the kudzu and Spanish moss reclaiming the scorched earth with startling speed. Contemporary newspaper clippings from the Louisiana Gazette in St. Francisville mention the fire only in passing, burying the report on the third page amidst news of the faltering Confederate war effort. The brief article cites an unfortunate accident resulting from holiday festivities, a transparent attempt to mask the reality of a successful slave insurrection. This editorial suppression is a standard feature of the period's journalism, designed to prevent the spread of dangerous ideas among the enslaved populations of the river parishes. However, the lack of publicity in white presses did not equate to a lack of knowledge among the black community. The Grapevine Telegraph, an informal network of communication that spanned plantations, carried the true story faster than any printed broadsheet could have hoped to achieve. The account that follows is reconstructed from these disparate sources. The court documents filed in 1863 regarding the estate of Julian Vane, the oral testimonies recorded by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, and the private correspondence of the terrified neighbors who survived the era. It is a story that necessitates the peeling back of layers of myth to reveal the strategic core of a man pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. While the supernatural elements of the legend provide comfort and inspiration, the structural reality of the event speaks to a profound and terrifying competence. Elias Thorne was a ghost, but he was a ghost of his own making, forged in the specific crucible of the Briarwood Plantation and the unique geography of West Feliciana Parish. To understand the magnitude of the Christmas Eve fire, one must first map the terrain that served as both Elias Thorne's prison and his sanctuary. Briarwood Plantation sat on a bend of the Mississippi River, distinct from the Atchafalaya Basin swamps, yet equally isolated by the thick canebrakes and bayous that cut through the land. The property encompassed over 3,000 acres of prime cotton land, a vast expanse that offered infinite shadows for a man determined not to be seen. The proximity to the river provided a natural corridor for escape, but also a damp, mist-laden environment that could conceal smoke, movement, and even life itself. This landscape was not merely a backdrop for the events of 1862. It was an active participant, a hostile force that Thorne bent to his will. The hierarchy that dominated this landscape was rigid and absolute, a pyramid of power designed to crush the human spirit beneath the weight of economic necessity and racial superiority. At the apex stood Julian Vane, a man whose belief in his own divine right to rule was as unshakable as the columns of his Greek Revival mansion. The institution he presided over was not a relic of a bygone era, but a thriving modern business enterprise deeply integrated into the global textile market. To disrupt this machine required more than anger. It required an intimate understanding of its gears and levers. Thorne did not just attack the men, he attacked the infrastructure of their dominance, turning their own property lines and perceived security into the very tools of their demise. The official charter for Briarwood Plantation dates back to 1792, granted by the Spanish colonial government to Colonel Silas Vane, a veteran of the Revolutionary War who sought his fortune in the rich alluvial soil of West Feliciana Parish. The original land grant specified a tract of 3,400 acres, situated on a high bluff overlooking a treacherous bend in the Mississippi River. Colonel Vane utilized the labor of 132 enslaved Africans to clear the dense cane brakes and erect the first modest dwelling, a structure that would eventually give way to a monument of Greek Revival architecture. By the time his grandson Julian inherited the property in the 1840s, the estate had transformed into a self-sustaining engine of commerce, producing not just cotton, but also the intricate social hierarchy that necessitated the events of 1862. The physical layout of Briarwood was designed with the precision of a military encampment, intended to enforce submission through geometry and surveillance. The big house, a two-story mansion featuring 6 massive columns and a wraparound gallery, dominated the highest point of the bluff, offering an unobstructed view of the slave quarters situated a quarter-mile to the south. This distance was deliberate, providing the white family a buffer from the noise and smell of the enslaved population while ensuring that any movement in the quarters could be monitored with a spyglass from the upper veranda. Between these two poles lay the operational heart of the plantation, the gin house, the blacksmith forge, and the commissary, all arranged to funnel the daily traffic of the estate past the overseer's cottage. Julian Vane presided over this domain with the demeanor of a benevolent patriarch, a carefully curated image that masked a cold, economic ruthlessness. Born in 1814, Vane was educated in Philadelphia, but returned to Louisiana, embracing the fervent belief that the Southern social order was divinely ordained. He served on the parish police jury and the local school board, cultivating relationships with the Baptist ministry to shield his operations in moral legitimacy. Financial records from 1850 indicate that Vane possessed a net worth exceeding $200,000, a staggering sum derived entirely from the backs of his human property. He viewed his slaves not as people, but as appreciating assets, listing them alongside livestock and farming implements in his annual tax assessments. Beneath the veneer of gentility lay the harsh reality of the field operations, orchestrated by the head overseer, Rufus Cobb, a man whose reputation for violence was known throughout the river parishes. Cobb, a transplant from the piney woods of Mississippi, had risen to his position through a willingness to enforce discipline that even the most hardened planters found distasteful. He earned a salary of $600 annually, a wage supplemented by bonuses for exceeding cotton production quotas, incentivizing a regime of terror. Unlike Vane, who preferred psychological manipulation, Cobb spoke the language of the lash, leaving a trail of scarred backs and broken spirits in his wake. His presence on the property was a constant looming threat that kept the enslaved population in a state of perpetual anxiety. The domestic sphere of the big house was governed by Eleanor Vane, a woman whose cruelty distinguished itself through psychological torment rather than physical violence. The daughter of a prominent Charleston family, she brought to Briarwood a refined sadism, enforcing a code of conduct for the house servants that was as rigid as it was arbitrary. She was known to inspect the hands of the kitchen staff for calluses before allowing them to handle her linens, and she delighted in the petty power of withholding rations as punishment for perceived slights. Her presence created a schism between the house slaves and the field hands, a deliberate strategy of division that Vane utilized to prevent unity among the enslaved. This domestic tyranny provided the emotional context for the deep-seated resentment that would eventually fuel the conspiracy. The labor force at Briarwood was categorized into distinct tiers, each essential to the economic output of the estate. The field hands, numbering 188 men, women, and children, bore the brunt of the agricultural cycle, working from first light to candlelight during the picking season. The pressure to produce was immense. Vane expected each hand to pick a minimum of 200 pounds of cotton per day, a quota that failure to meet would result in immediate corporal punishment. The plantation ledgers show that in 1856 alone, the operation ginned and pressed over 420 bales of cotton, a yield that placed Briarwood among the top producers in the region. This economic success was built on a foundation of exhaustion and fear, a pressure cooker waiting for a spark. The skilled artisans on the plantation represented a privileged minority within the enslaved community, a group that included coopers, wheelwrights, and the crucial carpenters responsible for maintaining the estate's infrastructure. These individuals enjoyed a degree of mobility and autonomy unknown to the field hands, often traveling to neighboring plantations for specialized work or trading small crafts for extra provisions. However, their status was precarious, entirely dependent on the continued favor of the master. Their position as trustees placed them in a liminal space, viewed with suspicion by the field hands, yet never fully accepted by the white hierarchy. It was within this narrow stratum of skilled labor that the architect of the plantation's destruction would emerge, leveraging his access to map the weaknesses of the system. The blacksmith shop and the carpenter's shed were located near the stables, conveniently close to the big house for quick repairs, yet far enough to allow the workers a moment of unsupervised breath. The carpenter's role was particularly vital, as the humid Louisiana climate rotted wood with alarming speed, necessitating constant replacement of flooring, window frames, and structural beams. This role required a sharp mind and a knowledge of geometry, and the lead carpenter was often allowed to keep a set of tools that would be strictly forbidden to other slaves. These tools, saws, hammers, and chisels, were instruments of creation, but in the hands of a man with a grievance, they held the potential to dismantle the master's world board by board. The social architecture of Briarwood rested on a foundation of silence and surveillance, a system designed to stamp out dissent before it could take root. Informants were cultivated among the driver class, slaves who were granted minor authority in exchange for reporting on the activities of their peers. This atmosphere of mistrust made organized resistance nearly impossible, forcing any spark of rebellion to remain deeply buried. Yet, despite the omnipresent threat of the whip and the auction block, the human desire for dignity could not be extinguished. It merely went underground, finding expression in whispered conversations, coded spirituals, and the silent, seething patience of those who waited for a moment of vulnerability. It was into this rigidly stratified world that Elias Thorne arrived in the winter of 1848, purchased at the New Orleans slave market for the sum of $1,200. Listed in the transaction records as able-bodied carpenter, 25 years of age, Thorne possessed a specific set of skills that immediately elevated him above the status of a common field hand. He was a man of medium height, but immense physical density, his muscles hardened by years of swinging a hammer. But it was not his physical strength that made him a threat. It was the intelligence in his eyes, a keen, observant quality that Julian Vane failed to recognize as dangerous. Thorne's arrival at Briarwood was the first stone cast into a still pond, the ripples of which would eventually consume the estate. Elias Thorne was not born into the intricate web of Briarwood's lineage, but arrived as an outsider, a distinct advantage in a society built on deep-rooted familiarity. His origins traced back to a smaller tobacco farm in the rolling hills of Tennessee, where he was sold away from his mother at the tender age of 14. This early displacement severed his emotional ties to a specific place, fostering a detached perspective that allowed him to survey his surroundings with a cold, analytical eye. By the time he reached the New Orleans auction block, he had already mastered the basics of carpentry, a trade learned from an aging craftsman who treated him with a modicum of respect. This skill was his armor, distinguishing him from the masses of field hands and granting him a fragile shield of utility that temporarily protected him from the worst brutalities of the system. The transition to Briarwood in 1848 placed Thorne in a unique position within the plantation's geography, operating in the liminal space between the big house and the quarters. His duties required him to traverse the entire estate, repairing shutters for Eleanor Vane one moment and fixing a cabin door for a field hand the next. This freedom of movement was a double-edged sword. While it offered him a broader view of the operation, it also required him to maintain a delicate balance of subservience. He learned to navigate the overseer's moods and the mistress's whims, developing a mask of stoic compliance that hid a mind constantly cataloging the structural weaknesses of the world around him. He was not merely repairing the plantation, he was memorizing its blueprint. It was during his rounds near the weaving house in the spring of 1853 that Elias's attention was captured by Letty, a woman whose spirit remained unbroken despite years of toil in the cotton rows. Letty was known among the enslaved community for her voice, a powerful instrument that could carry a spiritual across the fields, soothing the frayed nerves of her fellow laborers. She possessed a quiet fortitude that resonated with Elias's own internal resilience, and their connection was immediate and profound. Unlike the transient interactions common in the quarters, their courtship was built on stolen moments and silent understandings, a shared recognition of humanity in an environment designed to strip it away. This bond would become the emotional anchor of Elias's life at Briarwood, grounding his abstract desire for freedom in a tangible future. The couple jumped the broom in a secret ceremony held behind the blacksmith shop, a tradition that held no legal weight in the eyes of Louisiana law, but bound them together in the eyes of their community. For 3 years, this union provided a rare sanctuary from the daily dehumanization, a private world where they could speak of dreams and hopes without fear of retribution. Letty's influence softened Elias's rough edges, encouraging him to share the knowledge his mother had passed to him, including the forbidden skill of reading. In the safety of their cabin, by the light of a tallow candle, he would trace letters in the dirt floor, teaching her the symbols that represented freedom. This domestic happiness was a precarious structure built on a foundation that could be shattered at any moment by a master's whim. The summer of 1856 brought with it a heat wave of unprecedented intensity, a suffocating blanket of humidity that settled over the Mississippi Valley and tested the endurance of every living soul at Briarwood. The temperature soared past 100 degrees for weeks on end, drying the cotton plants in the fields and turning the air in the quarters into a thick, unbreathable haze. Water rations were strictly controlled, and the field hands were pushed to the brink of collapse under the watchful eye of Rufus Cobb, who seemed impervious to the elements. The heat acted as a pressure cooker, raising tensions and lowering the threshold for violence, creating an environment where a single spark could ignite a conflagration. It was within this crucible that the trajectory of Elias Thorne's life was irrevocably altered. On the afternoon of August 14th, Letty, now heavily pregnant, collapsed in the furrows of the lower field, her body finally succumbing to the relentless heat and exertion. Witness accounts from fellow field hands describe a moment of confusion followed by a rush of concern, quickly stifled by the approach of the overseer. Letty lay motionless in the dust, her breathing shallow, while Cobb sat atop his horse, annoyed by the interruption to the day's quota. Elias, working on a trellis near the big house, saw the commotion and sprinted across the open ground, his tool belt banging against his hip. He arrived to find his wife unresponsive, her skin burning to the touch, and the overseer's face twisted in irritation rather than mercy. The confrontation that followed was brief and catastrophic, a collision of humanity and authority that shattered Elias's carefully constructed mask of obedience. When Elias knelt to lift Letty, pleading for permission to carry her to the shade, Cobb responded with a swift strike of his riding crop, the leather cutting a jagged line across Elias's face. The blow was intended to enforce submission, but for Elias, it severed the last thread of his adherence to the plantation's laws. He ignored the pain and lifted his wife, but Cobb blocked his path, ordering him back to work and declaring that a slave who could not stand was a slave who did not deserve water. The cruelty was casual, calculated to remind the watching crowd of the cost of defiance. For 3 agonizing hours, Elias sat in the merciless sun, holding Letty's hand as her life ebbed away, denied even a cup of water by the overseer's strict order. There was no doctor summoned, no respite from the heat, only the indifferent gaze of the white hierarchy watching from the veranda of the big house. When she finally slipped away, taking their unborn child with her, a profound silence descended upon Elias, a silence far more terrifying than any scream of rage. The man who knelt in the dust was no longer the compliant carpenter who had arrived 8 years prior. The emotional core of his existence had been cauterized by the systemic cruelty of the institution. The grief was absolute, but it did not break him. It refined him into something harder and colder. The burial took place that night in the cemetery, a patch of barren earth hidden behind the quarters where generations of the enslaved had been laid to rest without marker or ceremony. Elias dug the grave himself, the physical labor serving as a conduit for a rage too immense to verbalize. The community gathered to sing "Steal Away," their voices low and mournful, but Elias did not join in. He stood apart, watching the dirt cover the simple shroud, his mind already turning away from the past and toward a future that offered no solace except for the possibility of retribution. The love that had defined his life was gone, replaced by a singular burning purpose that would require every ounce of his skill and patience to execute. As the mourners dispersed and the shadows of the night reclaimed the cemetery, Elias made a silent vow at the foot of the unmarked grave. He realized then that escape was not enough. Fleeing to the north would leave the monsters who killed Letty untouched, free to perpetuate their crimes on others. The legal system would offer no justice, and the church offered only the promise of a better life after death. Elias rejected these passive avenues. The decision solidified in his mind with the hardness of iron. He would not run away from Briarwood in the traditional sense. Instead, he would disappear into the margins of the plantation, becoming a ghost in his own home, until the moment arrived to balance the scales. The siege of Briarwood had begun. 3 nights after the earth settled over Letty's grave, Elias Thorne executed the initial phase of his disappearance, vanishing from his cabin under the cover of a moonless sky. He carried nothing but a stolen drawstring bag containing a dull file, a tinderbox, and a strip of dried beef, traveling light to ensure speed. He did not head north toward the theoretical freedom of the Ohio River, but rather east toward the treacherous and sprawling Honey Island swamp. This movement was immediately interpreted by the plantation hierarchy as a standard flight response, triggering the well-rehearsed protocols of pursuit. The bugle sounded from the big house before dawn, signaling the mobilization of the patrol, a sound that usually heralded the beginning of a short and violent hunt. Julian Vane authorized an immediate and aggressive response, authorizing a reward of $500 for the capture of the fugitive, dead or alive. The financial incentive drew professional slave catchers from as far as Baton Rouge, men who knew the local waterways with a predatory intimacy. For 4 days, the swamp echoed with the baying of bloodhounds and the crack of rifles, a chaotic symphony of violence intended to instill terror in the hearts of anyone contemplating a similar exodus. Vane, confident in the capabilities of his men and the harshness of the terrain, reportedly sat on his gallery with a ledger, already calculating the write-off of his lost property. The search parties combed the interior of the swamp, dragging the bayous and scouring the thickets, fully expecting to find a corpse. The environment of the Honey Island swamp was an adversary as formidable as any armed patrol, a vast labyrinth of black water, cypress knees, and dense undergrowth that seemed to actively resist human intrusion. Elias navigated this hostile terrain by utilizing the survival skills his mother had passed down to him, moving only at night and submerging himself in the murky water during the day to avoid detection. He endured the biting insects and the threat of alligators, existing in a state of heightened sensory awareness that stripped away the remaining softness of his humanity. The pursuit was relentless, but the density of the swamp provided a curtain of secrecy, allowing him to evade the dogs by wading through the deep sloughs where scent trails were instantly washed away. On the fifth day, the intensity of the search began to wane as the hunters grew exhausted and the trail grew cold. The bloodhounds returned to their handlers, confused and unable to maintain a scent line, leading the catchers to surmise that the fugitive had either perished or managed to escape the immediate vicinity. Vain, frustrated by the lack of results and the mounting costs of the expedition, ordered the patrols to be scaled back, though he maintained a watch on the main roads. It was during this lull, when the white men assumed the chase was effectively over, that Elias made the strategic decision that would define the next 7 years of his existence. Instead of continuing his flight deeper into the wilderness or turning north toward the precarious promise of the Underground Railroad, Elias stopped. He found a dry hummock of high ground deep within the tree line and sat in silence, calculating the odds of survival versus the odds of satisfaction. He understood that reaching free soil would save his body but condemn his soul to a lifetime of unresolved grief. The law provided no recourse for Letty's death, and God had remained silent in the face of her suffering. The realization crystallized in his mind. True justice could only be served by his own hand, and it could only be served at the source of his pain. Elias turned his back on the north and began a slow, arduous circuit back toward the plantation, moving against the grain of every fugitive instinct. This counterintuitive maneuver was his greatest tactical asset. No one would think to look for a runaway on the very property he had fled. He utilized the distraction of the waning search parties to slip through the perimeter, moving like a phantom through the canebrakes. The journey back was not a retreat, but an infiltration, transforming him from a hunted animal into a stalking predator. He was no longer running away from bondage. He was running toward a reckoning. Upon reaching the boundaries of Briarwood, Elias did not reveal himself to the enslaved community or attempt to hide in the familiar quarters. Instead, he secluded himself in a dense thicket of palmetto and briar on the southern edge of the property, observing the daily rhythms of the estate from a new vantage point. He watched as the patrollers returned to the big house, empty-handed and weary, reporting to Vane that the swamps had likely claimed the carpenter. The master, eager to close the chapter on the embarrassing incident, accepted the narrative of death, choosing to believe that the environment had delivered the punishment he could not. Julian Vane, seeking to cement the lesson of Thorne's failed escape, ordered the construction of the limestone marker mentioned in the oral histories. The stone was placed at the edge of the property line, facing the swamp, etched with a grim warning to all who passed. It declared that the fugitive had perished, a lie that served to reassure the white populace and intimidate the enslaved. The stone was a monument to Vane's arrogance, a symbol of his belief that he owned not just the land and the people, but the narrative of their lives and deaths. By raising the stone, Vane unknowingly granted Elias the ultimate cover, the invisibility of a dead man. With the search officially called off and his death symbolically cemented, Elias Thorne began the process of establishing his permanent presence on the plantation. He was a ghost haunting the periphery, a specter of Vane's own creation. The transition from fugitive to phantom was complete. He had vanished from the world of the living to inhabit the shadows of Briarwood. This was not a hiding place, but a staging ground, and as the plantation settled into its autumn rhythm, Elias began to map out the geography of his revenge with the precision of the carpenter he once was. The 7-year siege had officially begun. The immediate priority for Elias Thorne was establishing a sanctuary that defied the rigid surveillance of the plantation, a location so inhospitable that it would be effectively invisible to the white hierarchy. He identified a target in the far southeastern corner of the estate, a region avoided by both the enslaved laborers and the overseers due to its isolation. Here, amidst a tangle of overgrown briars and water oaks, stood the skeletal remains of the old indigo processing mill. Abandoned since the War of 1812, the structure was a crumbling monument to a failed agricultural experiment, its brick vats cracked and its roof long since rotted into the soil. It was a place of decay, regarded by the community as cursed, making it the perfect fortress for a dead man. Elias approached the ruins under the cover of a heavy thunderstorm in late August, using the noise of the rain and thunder to mask his initial reconnaissance. The main processing floor had long since collapsed, but the foundation, built from thick river stones, remained intact, creating a series of subterranean chambers that had once held the fermenting indigo vats. These dark, damp spaces were now dry, protected by the arch of the masonry above them. Elias cleared a small area in the deepest recess of the ruin, carefully displacing the accumulated debris of decades without disturbing the exterior appearance of the site. He constructed a sleeping platform from rotted beams scavenged from the floor joists, establishing a minimal base of operations. The mechanics of his survival required a discipline that bordered on the monastic, a daily routine of silence and invisibility that would have broken a lesser spirit. Water was collected in discarded gourds during rainstorms, and he dug a concealed latrine downriver from the site to prevent contamination and detection. He forbade himself the luxury of a fire during daylight hours, relying on the thermal mass of the stone walls to regulate the temperature. The isolation was absolute. For weeks, the only sounds he heard were the calls of nesting herons and the distant rhythmic boom of the steamboats on the river. He was learning to exist in the margins, becoming a part of the landscape rather than an intruder upon it. Securing a sustainable food source without exposing himself to the commissary or the smoke of cooking fires presented a lethal challenge that Elias solved with engineering precision. He constructed a series of primitive fish traps from woven willow branches and placed them in a quiet slough, accessible from the rear of the mill, harvesting catfish and gar under the cover of darkness. He also identified a wild patch of persimmons and muscadines within the swamp buffer, supplementing his meager protein intake with seasonal foraging. Every calorie was earned through patience and risk, as a single misstep in the underbrush could draw the attention of a patroller or a rival scavenger. However, passive foraging would not sustain the energy levels required for the long game he intended to play, forcing him to adopt riskier tactics closer to the center of power. Elias began to exploit the blind spots in the plantation's waste management, specifically the midden heap located behind the kitchen house. Under the darkest phase of the moon, he would ghost across the manicured lawn to the pile, retrieving discarded turnip tops, corn cobs, and occasionally leftover fat from the big house kitchen. It was a humiliating necessity for a man who had once been a respected artisan, but he viewed the scraps as fuel for his vengeance rather than a degradation of his dignity. To move effectively between his hidden base and the center of the estate, Elias mapped out a network of concealed corridors through the dense cane brakes and drainage ditches that crisscrossed the property. He identified 3 distinct routes that offered maximum concealment, each winding through terrain that would tear the clothing and skin of an uninitiated traveler. He memorized the location of every fence post, every fallen log, and every patch of quicksand, navigating the estate with an intimacy that surpassed even the oldest field hands. This mental map became his most valuable weapon, allowing him to appear and disappear like a phantom, traversing the distance between the indigo mill and the big house in under 20 minutes. His previous life as a carpenter provided him with a unique advantage, granting him an intimate understanding of the structural anatomy of the estate's buildings. He knew which floorboards in the gin house squeaked and which hinges on the kitchen door were loose enough to lift from their pins without a sound. This knowledge allowed him to infiltrate the perimeter of the domestic areas without triggering the auditory alarms that protected the White family. He moved through the shadows of the outbuildings with a fluid, silent grace, observing the lit windows of the big house with the detached focus of a predator stalking a herd. He was no longer a fugitive. He was a resident of the darkness. As the weeks turned into months, Elias established a series of hidden caches around the property, burying supplies in watertight crocks to ensure he would never be caught without essential tools. He secreted away a stolen hammer, a coil of rope, and several flint stones in locations that only he knew, creating a safety net for the inevitable moment when his luck would be tested. These caches were not merely survival gear. They were the logistical backbone of a campaign of harassment. He also began to accumulate small quantities of turpentine and lamp oil, diverting them in quantities so small that their absence was never noticed by the inventory clerks. The transition from survival to observation was seamless, as Elias began to use his hidden vantage points to study the daily routines of his enemies. He noted the specific time that Julian Vane retired to his study, the hour that Eleanor Vane took her afternoon tea, and the shift changes of the night watchman. He watched Rufus Cobb from the edge of the cane brake, memorizing the overseer's patrol patterns and his moments of distraction. This period of intense, silent scrutiny was the foundation of his strategy, allowing him to compile a mental dossier of weaknesses, schedules, and vulnerabilities that would later be exploited with devastating precision. By the onset of winter in 1856, Elias Thorne had successfully embedded himself into the secret infrastructure of Briarwood, a ghost haunting the machine of his oppressors. He had conquered the elements, secured his sustenance, and mapped the terrain, achieving a level of autonomy that was theoretically impossible for a fugitive. Yet, survival and observation were merely the preliminary stages of his plan. He realized that to truly dismantle the hierarchy that had murdered his wife, he needed more than just his own eyes. He needed intelligence from within the quarters. The time had come to bridge the gap between the phantom and the living, to make contact with the network of souls he had left behind. The realization that solitary observation was insufficient forced Elias to confront the dangerous prospect of re-establishing contact with the enslaved community. He needed eyes that could penetrate the walls of the big house and ears that could interpret the whispers of the big house parlor. His target was old Cato, a man in his 70s who tended the plantation's kitchen gardens and was widely regarded by the white hierarchy as a harmless relic of a bygone era. Cato possessed a freedom of movement granted to the elderly, allowing him to shuffle between the quarters and the outbuildings with minimal scrutiny. Elias identified him as the critical junction point for intelligence, but initiating contact without exposing himself required a method that relied on shared cultural codes rather than direct speech. In the lore of the slave quarters, certain symbols served as a silent language, a method of communication that existed beneath the threshold of white understanding. Elias utilized a specific arrangement of broken cane stalks and smooth river stones near the fence post of Cato's garden, a signal known only to those initiated in the old traditions. The sign indicated a request for a parley, a brush arbor summons to a safe location. For 3 nights, Elias waited in the briars near the garden, watching the old man tend to his collard greens, unsure if Cato would acknowledge the subtle plea or report the anomaly to the overseer. The tension was palpable, as a single misstep could result in the exposure of his sanctuary. On the 4th night, Cato deviated from his usual routine, shuffling past the garden gate and heading toward the abandoned indigo mill under the guise of gathering medicinal roots. Elias emerged from the darkness like a materialized memory, his appearance causing the old man to startle only slightly. The conversation was hushed and tense, with Cato expressing a mix of awe and terror at the realization that the carpenter had never truly left the property. Elias bypassed pleasantries, stating his need for information and his willingness to risk capture to obtain it. He did not speak of escape, but of justice, a distinction that Cato noted with a heavy, knowing silence. Cato agreed to serve as the primary informant, motivated by a lifetime of suppressed rage and the memory of his own kin sold away. They established a protocol for the transfer of intelligence that relied on the natural debris of the plantation. Cato would leave written notes, scrawled on scraps of stolen paper or bark, in the hollow of a specific dead cypress tree located near the edge of the swamp. The retrieval signal was a crude chalk mark on the side of the commissary shed, a mark that would be invisible to the overseers but clear to Elias. This dead drop system ensured that the 2 men rarely had to meet face to face, minimizing the risk of physical proximity. The intelligence began to flow in the winter of 1856, painting a detailed portrait of the Vane household's vulnerabilities. Cato's initial reports confirmed that Julian Vane was struggling to secure credit for the upcoming planting season, as the national financial markets remained unstable. More crucially, Cato provided insights into the domestic sphere, detailing Eleanor Vane's reliance on laudanum to sleep and her frequent fits of temper toward the house staff. This information allowed Elias to map the psychological state of his enemies, noting the cracks in their facade of absolute control. The information was not merely gossip, it was strategic data that could be weaponized. Through Cato, Elias began to cultivate a wider network, expanding his reach without ever revealing his physical location. He identified Samuel, the blacksmith, whose strength was matched only by his hatred for Rufus Cobb. Samuel's position near the stables allowed him to monitor the movement of horses and carriages, providing early warning of visitors or the arrival of slave patrols. Another asset was Ruth, a house servant who worked in the laundry, who had access to the bedrooms and the ability to read the personal correspondence left on the master's desk. Each of these individuals operated in isolation, unaware of the full scope of Elias's plan, fed only the information necessary to perform their specific tasks. The recruitment of young Jacob, a stable hand with a talent for mimicry, provided Elias with a layer of operational security. Jacob could imitate the calls of local birds with uncanny accuracy, a skill Elias utilized to signal danger or to draw away unwanted attention during his nocturnal movements. Jacob also served as a secondary courier when Cato's movements were restricted by weather or illness. The network was structured like a spiderweb, with Elias at the center, pulling the threads to gather the vibrations of the plantation. This decentralized structure ensured that if one node was compromised, the entire operation would not collapse. By the spring of 1857, Elias had transformed the indigo mill into a command center, accumulating a comprehensive dossier on the Briarwood hierarchy. He learned the schedule of the night watchman, the location of the spare keys to the big house, and the specific days when the parish constable made his rounds. He discovered that Rufus Cobb was skimming small amounts of cotton to sell to a riverboat captain, a crime that carried severe penalties if exposed. Elias filed this knowledge away, understanding that internal corruption could be as destructive as external force. The accumulation of secrets was a slow, deliberate process, akin to the loading of a cannon. The psychological burden of this prolonged conspiracy weighed heavily on the informants, who lived in constant fear of discovery. Cato, in particular, struggled with the moral implications of aiding a man who intended to bring violence to the plantation. He confided in coded conversations with Elias that he feared the consequences of failure, not just for themselves, but for the innocent families in the quarters. Elias acknowledged the risk, but countered with the argument that the current state of existence was a slow death, and that a chance at freedom, even a violent one, was worth the peril. This moral calculus bound the group together in a covenant of silence. As the network solidified, Elias began to test its capabilities through small acts of calibrated disruption. He requested that Samuel loosen the shoe on the overseer's favorite horse, or that Ruth misplace a critical bill of lading. These acts of minor sabotage served a dual purpose. They sowed chaos among the white hierarchy and demonstrated the efficacy of the intelligence network. Each successful disruption bolstered the confidence of the informants and deepened their commitment to the cause. The machinery of resistance was now fully operational, humming quietly beneath the loud, brutal rhythm of the plantation, waiting for the moment to shift from harassment to total war. The spring of 1857 brought a sudden, jarring escalation to the quiet war Elias was waging, transforming his abstract strategic goals into concrete targets. Intelligence from Ruth revealed that a consortium of creditors was pressuring Julian Vane to liquidate a portion of his stock to cover mounting debts related to a failed shipping venture. On March the 12th, a flatboat docked at the Briarwood Landing, carrying two traders whose names would soon be inscribed on Elias's mental ledger of the doomed. They were Silas Galt and Titus Kane, men known throughout the river parishes for their ruthless efficiency in breaking families apart, a professional cruelty that operated under the sanitized guise of commerce. The sale took place on the lawn near the gin house, a chaotic and terrifying event for the enslaved population, who watched in paralyzed silence as human beings were inspected like livestock. Elias observed the proceedings from the safety of a dense magnolia thicket, his vantage point offering a clear line of sight to the transaction. He watched as Galt examined the teeth of a woman named Nina, a close confidant of Letty, while her two young children clung to her skirt in terror. Vane stood by with a ledger, indifferent to the tears, his focus entirely on the calculation of profit margins needed to satisfy his distant bankers. The casual inhumanity of the scene hardened something deep within Elias's resolve. When the transaction was finalized, Nina and her children were loaded onto the flatboat, their wails echoing across the water as they were separated from everything they knew. The horror of the moment served to crystallize Elias's ultimate objective. He understood that sabotage and economic harassment were insufficient responses to such profound evil. That evening, he retreated to the indigo mill and carved 4 names into the stone wall of his chamber: Julian Vane, Eleanor Vane, Rufus Cobb, and now Silas Galt and Titus Kane. The list represented a hierarchy of accountability, a promise that the architects of this misery would eventually face a reckoning. The departure of the traders marked a shift in Elias's methodology, moving from passive intelligence gathering to active, kinetic disruption. He began to target the physical infrastructure of the cotton economy with a refined malice, aiming to bleed the plantation of its profitability. In late April, he slipped into the gin house under the cover of a storm and used a heavy iron bar to shatter a main bearing on the cotton press, a critical component that required weeks to replace. The subsequent delay in processing the crop cost Vane thousands in potential revenue and damaged his reputation with the New Orleans factors, a blow that struck at the master's financial standing. Throughout the summer of 1857, a cascade of seemingly accidental misfortunes plagued Briarwood, each incident meticulously planned and executed by the phantom in the swamp. A quantity of seed cotton stored in the barn was discovered to be infested with weevils, a disaster that necessitated the destruction of the entire store. Simultaneously, the water pump for the steam engine failed catastrophically, an act of mechanical sabotage that Elias orchestrated by introducing debris into the valve system. These were not random acts of vandalism, but calculated strikes against the economic heart of the plantation, designed to increase the pressure on Vane and his overseers. The worsening financial straits of the estate began to fray the nerves of the white hierarchy, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and recrimination that Elias exploited with precision. Rufus Cobb, under immense pressure to maintain order amidst the chaos, turned his brutality inward, meting out increasingly severe punishments for minor infractions. This escalation of violence, however, did not quell the unrest. Rather, it deepened the reservoir of hatred that fueled the silent network. Samuel and Ruth fed Elias information on Cobb's patrol routes, allowing the phantom to avoid capture while the overseer's sanity slowly unraveled, his nights plagued by the feeling of being watched. By 1858, the network had matured into a sophisticated resistance cell capable of intercepting communications and manipulating the flow of information. Ruth began to misroute Vane's outgoing mail, delaying payments and correspondence for weeks at a time, further damaging his credit with suppliers. She also provided Elias with copies of the plantation's inventories, allowing him to track the movement of goods and identify the most valuable times to strike. The conspiracy had woven itself into the daily operations of Briarwood, turning the enslaved population into an active, invisible army, working in concert to dismantle the institution from within. The psychological impact of this prolonged siege was not limited to the oppressors. It also began to alter the mindset of the enslaved community. Whispers of the shadow of Briarwood spread through the quarters, a myth that offered a counter-narrative to the imposed doctrine of helplessness. The knowledge that one of their own was fighting back, surviving in the swamp, and striking at the master's wallet provided a spark of hope in the profound darkness. This morale boost was a strategic asset, as valuable as any weapon, fostering a sense of unity and resistance that made the overseer's job increasingly difficult. As the decade drew to a close, the nation itself began to fracture, mirroring the structural instability Elias had introduced to Briarwood. The election of 1860 brought the issue of slavery to the forefront of the national consciousness, and the air in West Feliciana Parish grew heavy with the scent of impending war. Elias watched these developments from his hidden lair, understanding that the coming conflict would provide the ultimate cover for his retribution. The system he was fighting was beginning to collapse under its own weight, and he was prepared to give it the final, decisive push it needed to fall. The list of names on the stone wall remained a silent testament to his patience, waiting for the moment when the opportunity for justice would finally arrive. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860 sent a shock wave through the social strata of West Feliciana Parish, fracturing the illusion of permanence that the planter class had cultivated for generations. For Julian Vane, the political shift represented an existential threat to his economic sovereignty, prompting a shift from arrogance to a defensive paranoia. Letters discovered in the family archives revealed that Vane began to liquidate his liquid assets, converting banknotes into gold coin, which he secreted away in a floor safe within his study. He also increased the frequency of the night patrols, convinced that the Northern rhetoric would incite a general uprising among the enslaved population. The air at Briarwood grew thick with suspicion, and the whip cracked with renewed intensity as the white hierarchy sought to reassert dominance through terror. The outbreak of hostilities at Fort Sumter in April of 1861 transformed the abstract fear of change into a concrete reality of war. Louisiana's secession from the Union disrupted the intricate web of credit and supply that kept plantations like Briarwood solvent, as the federal blockade of the Mississippi River strangled the export of cotton. Elias observed these developments from his hidden vantage points, noting the departure of the younger white men for the Confederate Army and the resulting thinning of the overseer ranks. The plantation, once a self-sustaining fortress, began to feel like a garrison under siege, its defensive perimeter stretched thin by the demands of the conflict. This external pressure was the catalyst Elias had anticipated, the environmental factor that would expose the system's inherent fragility. With the reduction of the white male population available for patrol duty, the burden of maintaining order fell heavily on Rufus Cobb and a handful of elderly or infirm retainers. Cobb, agitated by the war news and his own dwindling authority, became increasingly erratic in his enforcement of discipline. He drank heavily in the evenings, his shouts of anger echoing from the overseer's cottage, providing Elias with audible confirmation of the man's unraveling composure. This volatility was dangerous as it lowered the threshold for violence, but it also created significant gaps in the plantation's surveillance net. The darkness that Elias inhabited grew deeper, allowing him to move closer to the center of power with less risk of detection. As the Union grip on the river tightened, Vane sought to project an image of unshakable strength to his neighbors and his slaves, refusing to show any sign of weakness. He convened a meeting of the local planter elite in the summer of 1861, delivering a tirade that was recorded in the diary of a neighbor, absolving the Confederacy of any potential failure and predicting a swift victory. However, his private actions contradicted his public bravado. He began to stockpile food and weaponry in the big house, transforming the mansion into a potential last-stand location. Elias noted these preparations with a cold satisfaction, recognizing that Vane was inadvertently concentrating his assets and his vulnerabilities under one roof. The winter of 1861 brought a biting cold to the Louisiana wetlands, forcing Elias to confront the physical limitations of his existence in the indigo mill. The temperature dropped below freezing for weeks on end, an anomaly for the region, and the scarcity of food became a critical issue as the plantation's resources were diverted to the war effort. Elias survived by utilizing his cache of stolen goods and relying on the network, which risked discovery, to bring him warm clothing and dried meat. This period of deprivation served to steel his resolve, stripping away the final vestiges of his attachment to comfort and cementing his transformation into an instrument of pure will. By late 1862, the Confederate losses in the Western theater had created a pervasive atmosphere of dread among the slave-holding class of Louisiana. Rumors of Union gunboats moving up the Mississippi reached the quarters, sparking a wave of hope and restlessness among the enslaved population that Vane struggled to suppress. He delivered sermons to his slaves on Sundays, citing scripture to justify their bondage and warning them that the northern invaders would bring only ruin and chaos. Elias listened to these speeches from the edge of the woods, dissecting the fear that underpinned Vane's words, understanding that the master's psychological control was slipping as fast as the Confederate hold on the river. In December of 1862, Cato brought Elias the intelligence that would crystallize the timeline for the final strike. Vane was planning a grand Christmas gathering, a defiant display of Southern hospitality and solidarity in the face of the Union advance. He had invited the remaining planters of the parish, as well as the slave traders, Silas Galt and Titus Kane, who were now operating as speculative buyers for the Confederate government. The convergence of these figures, every name on Elias's ledger, under one roof, presented a target of opportunity so perfect that it seemed like divine providence. The meeting was scheduled for December 24th, a date that would mark the end of Briarwood. The planning for the event consumed the big house, drawing the attention of the white hierarchy away from the periphery of the estate. Eleanor Vane directed the house servants with a manic energy, demanding a feast that rivaled those of the antebellum peak, despite the blockades. The irony of preparing a lavish celebration while the plantation's financial foundations crumbled was not lost on the enslaved staff, who moved through the motions with hidden resentment. For Elias, this gathering represented the ultimate concentration of the system's evil, a congregation of the guilty that would allow him to deliver a singular, devastating judgment. The confirmation of the guest list cemented Elias's decision to abandon the long game in favor of immediate action. He realized that waiting for the war to run its course might allow his targets to escape justice, either through flight or the chaos of battle. The Christmas gathering offered a closed environment, a moment when the oppressors would be gathered in a single, flammable structure, distracted by their own hubris. He began to mobilize his resources, checking the caches of turpentine and oil he had accumulated over the years and briefing his network on the necessity of absolute silence. The war had provided the cover, but the vengeance would be personal. As the date approached, the tension on the plantation reached a breaking point, a taut wire ready to snap. Vane walked the grounds with a loaded pistol, his eyes darting at every shadow, seemingly sensing the trap that was closing around him. The enslaved population picked up on the shift in the atmosphere, moving with a cautious, practiced rhythm that masked their anticipation. The stage was set for a confrontation that had been 7 years in the making, a collision of history and personal retribution that would reduce the legacy of Briarwood to ash. The phantom of the swamp was preparing to step into the light, and the fire he planned to set would burn through the long night of the Old South. December 23rd arrived under a slate-gray sky, the air heavy with the promise of a killing frost. Elias spent the daylight hours in the suffocating darkness of the indigo mill, meticulously inspecting his few resources: stolen matches, a knife with a whalebone handle, and his intimate knowledge of the big house's architecture. The silence of his hiding place was a stark contrast to the frantic energy he knew was consuming the mansion above. The previous 7 years had been a prelude to the events of the next 24 hours. He sharpened the blade with a slow, rhythmic motion, the sound echoing softly against the stone walls. The arrival of the guests began in the late afternoon, their carriages rolling up the crushed shell drive. Through the bare branches of the oaks, Elias observed the procession. Silas Galt and Titus Kane descended from a battered buggy, their faces ruddy from the cold and the whiskey they had already consumed. Julian Vane greeted them on the gallery with exaggerated warmth, his laughter carrying across the lawn. The sight of the traders, the men who had sold Nina and broken apart countless families, solidified Elias's resolve. They were not merely guests. They were the final entries in the ledger of judgment. Inside the big house, the kitchen was a chaotic inferno of activity. But in the slave quarters, a heavy silence had fallen. The network had been alerted. Samuel and Ruth knew that tonight would be the night, though they did not know the precise method. The tension among the enslaved was palpable, a stretched wire vibrating in the cold air. That evening, Elias moved from the mill to his secondary staging point, a drainage ditch that ran within 50 yards of the foundation. He carried with him the tools of his trade, no longer a carpenter's hammer, but the instruments of conflagration. The plan was to wait until the deep hours of the night, around 2 in the morning, when the festivities had died down and the household was lost in drunken sleep. However, the meticulous timeline Elias had constructed was shattered by a sudden, piercing scream from the direction of the stables. It was a sound of raw terror, the kind of sound that cuts through the cold air and demands attention. Elias froze, his hand hovering over the jar of turpentine. The plan, 7 years in the making, was being challenged by the unpredictability of the moment. Against all strategic logic, Elias moved toward the commotion, remaining low in the shadows. The scene that greeted him in the stable yard ignited a rage that surpassed even his hatred for Vane. Young Jacob and his pregnant wife, Hannah, had been discovered with forged papers, a desperate attempt to flee to the Union lines. Rufus Cobb had dragged them from the straw, his face twisted in a sneer of triumph and malice. Julian Vane stood nearby, his face flushed with drink and fury, shouting orders that would seal the couple's fate. The order was given for a public whipping, a Christmas lesson intended to cow the spirit of the enslaved community during the height of the holiday. They strapped Jacob to the whipping post in the center of the yard, his back bare to the freezing wind. Hannah was forced to kneel in the mud, her hands bound, forced to watch the torture of her husband. Elias watched from the darkness of a tool shed, his fingers tightening around the knife handle. He realized that he could not wait for the optimal moment. The calculus of justice had shifted. To allow this atrocity to proceed was to betray the very core of his mission. The decision crystallized in an instant. Elias abandoned the stealth of the shadows and moved with purpose toward the big house. If he could not wait for them to sleep, he would burn them while they watched. He circled to the north side of the mansion where the kitchens were located. The sounds of the party were loud, the piano playing a raucous tune that masked his movements. He uncorked the first jar of turpentine, pouring the acrid liquid along the base of the clapboard siding, soaking the dry, decades-old wood. He moved with terrifying speed, a specter gliding through the perimeter darkness. At the eastern gallery, he splashed a second jar against the latticework that supported the porch. At the southern face, he found the pile of firewood stacked against the wall for the fireplaces and doused it with the remainder of his accelerant. The wind whipped at his clothes, but the direction was favorable, pushing the draft toward the house. He was creating a ring of fire, a barrier that would turn the mansion into an inescapable trap. Elias crept to the western corner, the closest point to the whipping post. He could hear the crack of the whip and the groans of Jacob, sounds that fueled the spark of his flint. He struck the steel, catching a tuft of dry Spanish moss in his other hand. The flame caught instantly, a small orange bloom in the darkness. He touched it to the turpentine-soaked rag he had trailed from the foundation. The fire did not hesitate. It roared to life with a hiss, racing along the ground and climbing the wall like a living thing. The effect was immediate and devastating. Within seconds, the north side of the big house was engulfed in a wall of flame, the light casting long, violent shadows across the lawn. The music inside stopped abruptly, replaced by shouts of confusion and terror. The whipping stopped as Rufus Cobb turned toward the house, his face slack with disbelief. Elias did not pause to admire his work. He knew the chaos would only last a few moments before the panic set in. He slipped back into the shadows, his mind focused on the final stage of the night's work, the rescue. The fire was the distraction. The execution of the plan had only just begun. The inferno consumed the big house with a voracious speed that defied the damp December air, turning the mansion into a towering beacon, visible for miles across the river parishes. The dry, resinous pine of the framing ignited instantly, and the flames rushed upward to engulf the roof, shattering the tall windows with the intensity of the heat. Inside, the festivities dissolved into a chaotic stampede as the guests, including Silas Galt and Titus Kane, realized the exits were compromised. The fire acted as a deliberate hunter, herding the terrified inhabitants toward the central hall where the heat was already unbearable, effectively trapping those who had lingered inside. Julian Vane was seen on the upper gallery, his silhouette framed against the roar of the flames, screaming for water before the floorboards beneath him gave way. The structural failure cast him back into the heart of the fire, a grim symmetry that did not escape the notice of the enslaved witnesses standing rigid in the quarters. Eleanor Vane and several guests succumbed to the smoke and flames before they could navigate the burning corridors. The official death toll would later list 9 souls, including the master, his wife, the 2 traders, and 4 neighboring planters, though the exact number remained a subject of debate in the county records. While the mansion burned, the focus on the whipping post evaporated, leaving Jacob hanging semi-conscious and Hannah collapsed in the mud. Elias emerged from the darkness, no longer a phantom, but a tangible savior, moving with the precision of a soldier. He used his knife to sever the ropes binding Jacob's wrists, catching the young man before he fell. Hannah looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief, as Elias pulled her to her feet. He spoke no words of comfort, only commands, directing them toward the canebrake and the path to the swamp that he had traversed for 7 long years. Rufus Cobb, the overseer, stood transfixed by the destruction of his world, his face illuminated by the flickering orange light. As Elias guided the couple away from the chaos, Cobb's gaze drifted toward the movement in the yard. Through the heat haze, their eyes met. The overseer's mouth fell open in a silent scream of recognition, finally seeing the dead man walking. Elias paused for a fraction of a second, offering a cold, unreadable stare that confirmed Cobb's worst suspicions, before vanishing into the night with his charges. It was the only acknowledgment Elias would ever give to the institution that had tried to erase him. The escape was a blur of adrenaline and physical exertion, navigating the treacherous path to the Honey Island swamp. Elias led Jacob and Hannah through the freezing water and dense undergrowth, his intimate knowledge of the terrain guiding them past the search parties that would soon be scrambling. They moved towards a prearranged rendezvous point where the Underground Railroad operated a hidden station near the river. The fire behind them painted the sky a sickly orange, a marker of the end of an era and the birth of a legend. Hannah, clutching her stomach, moved with a strength fueled by the promise of freedom. By dawn on Christmas morning, the big house of Briarwood was reduced to a smoldering ruin of brick chimneys and ash. The heat had been so intense that the nearby oaks were scorched leafless, standing like blackened sentinels over the grave of the Vane dynasty. The enslaved population emerged from their cabins to witness the aftermath, their faces masks of shock and quiet. suppressed joy. The physical symbol of their oppression had been leveled, and though the field work would continue under new management in the coming months, the psychological chains had been shattered. The story of the fire would spread faster than the flames themselves. Rufus Cobb survived the night, but his mind was irrevocably broken by the sight of the burning house and the risen carpenter. He ranted in the quarters about ghosts and curses until he was dismissed from his position a week later. His end came in a tavern brawl in New Orleans in the winter of 1863, a pathetic conclusion for a man who had wielded such tyrannical power. The two assistant overseers, attempting to recapture Jacob and Hannah in Baton Rouge, were shot dead by Union sympathizers, their bodies discarded in the river. The retribution Elias had orchestrated was total, sparing only those who had been victims of the system. Elias Thorne did not stay to see the final collapse of the Confederacy or the legal emancipation of his people. After ensuring Jacob and Hannah were safe with conductors bound for Canada, he vanished into the vastness of the Louisiana swamp. Some oral histories suggest he made his way to the Union lines to serve with the colored troops, while others maintain he lived out his days as a hermit in the bayous. The ambiguity of his fate served to amplify his myth, transforming him from a man into an idea. He became the shadow of Briarwood, a spirit of resistance invoked in whispers. The legend of the invisible man who lived 7 years in the shadows to deliver one night of fire endured long after the scorched earth cooled. It was passed down through generations, coded in spirituals and whispered warnings to those who would oppress. The story served as a potent reminder that the powerless are never truly powerless if they possess the patience to wait and the courage to strike. The fire at Briarwood was not just a plantation tragedy. It was a declaration of humanity, proof that even in the darkest of dungeons, a single spark can illuminate the path to freedom.